Will you all please pray with me? God of provision and promise, we come before you hungry for your guidance and grateful for your daily mercies that sustain our living. In a world that teaches us to store up and hold tight, teach us again how to receive what we need, to trust that your grace is enough for this day. As we open our hearts to your message, feed us with the manna of your Spirit, truth for our minds, courage for our choices, and generosity for our living. And may these words and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. If you've ever been on a long road trip with kids, or maybe even sometimes with adults, you can probably guess the two most common questions that get asked from the back seat. Are we there yet? And how much farther? When can we eat? I'm hungry. And so the Israelites wandering through the wilderness after leaving Egypt were essentially one big backseat chorus of these two questions. They had left everything familiar and found themselves longing for what they had left behind, even though it had been oppressive. At least in Egypt, they knew what their next meal would be. Out there in the wilderness, the horizon stretched on forever, and their stomachs were empty. So they did what we all do when we're scared and hungry and uncertain. They complained. If only we had died in Egypt, they grumbled to Moses. At least there we sat around pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Now, to be fair, that's probably a little bit of nostalgic revisionist history, but hardship will do that to a person. It can make the past seem rosier than it actually was, don't you think? And yet, in their complaining, the people revealed something deeply human. When the future is uncertain, it is hard for us to trust that there will be enough. And God's response wasn't anger or punishment, but instead was provision. I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, God says. And every morning when the dew lifted, there was this fine, flaky substance on the ground, enough for everyone to gather what they needed for that day. The people called it manna, which literally means, what is it? Manna was not fancy. It wasn't meat and onions by the fire, but it sustained them, and it was enough. And here's the miracle. They were told to gather only what they needed, no more, no less. Those who gathered much had nothing left over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. Everyone had enough. If they tried to hoard it, which some did, some who tried to store up extra for tomorrow, it spoiled. Except, interestingly, on the Sabbath, where they were to rest and not gather manna. And then, and only then, the manna lasted. Through this, God was teaching the people something essential, something they'd have to learn before entering the Promised Land. That life with God is about daily trust. That enough is a spiritual practice. And that abundance is not measured by storage, but by sharing. The wilderness was never meant to be permanent. Instead, it was a classroom. The Israelites were learning how to be free, how to live not as slaves to Pharaoh's economy of endless production, but as beloved children of God, whose economy is grace. They had lived under a system where worth was defined by output, where security came from accumulation, where scarcity kept people in line. And I am thinking that sounds a little bit familiar to us. And now God was inviting them into a different way of being, a rhythm of trust instead of anxiety, a rhythm of gratitude instead of hoarding, a rhythm of Sabbath instead of burnout. The wilderness was a time to unlearn Egypt's habits and relearn dependence on divine generosity. Now, we may not wake up to literal manna on the ground, but many of us, if we're honest, still wrestle with those same wilderness questions. Will there be enough? Can I trust that God will provide? What if I give away too much and I don't have enough for myself? Stewardship season brings these questions to the surface in church communities. It's very tempting to approach stewardship as a pragmatic exercise, focusing on budgets and pledges and how we are to sustain our ministries. And yes, those things are important. But at its core, stewardship is spiritual formation. It is about learning again to live in trust instead of fear, learning to live with gratitude instead of grasping. And so every year we return to our covenanting and stewardship season where we make decisions about how we will invest our time and our energy and our money. And our focus is on what the church needs. But it is also a powerful time for us as individuals because we need to be reminded that generosity is how we are to live freely. The world around us constantly preaches a gospel of scarcity. There's not enough time, not enough money, not enough security. But the gospel of Jesus Christ declares the opposite. There is enough. And when we share what we have, grace multiplies. If you've ever been part of a meal train or see the way people show up for one another after a death in the family, or helped make sandwiches here for those living unhoused, you have witnessed manna. If you've ever watched a community rally around a family in crisis, or a neighbor who's lost their home, or a refugee newly arrived with nothing, you've seen manna. It is that mysterious grace that appears when we show up for one another. It often looks ordinary: a bag of groceries, a shared ride, a listening ear, a check in the mail right when it's needed most. My friends, manna still falls, it just takes different forms. And like in the story, manna cannot be hoarded. The grace that sustains us is meant to flow through us. If we hold on too tightly, it spoils, but when we share, it is life-giving. Notice that God does not send the people a month's worth of manna all at once. There is no heavenly Costco membership in the wilderness. They get what they need for today. And for us, that is often the hardest part, because we would rather have enough for tomorrow too, just to be safe, wouldn't we? But God's promise is enough for the moment. Grace for today's need, strength for today's struggle, light for today's step. That's why Jesus later teaches his disciples to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." Daily. Just enough for now. And maybe, just maybe, that's all we ever truly need. Because when we learn to trust God daily, we also learn to live gratefully. And grateful people naturally become generous people. So every stewardship and covenanting season, we are invited to return to the wilderness classroom, where we make our pledges of time when we make our pledges of time or consider our financial giving, we are practicing enough. We're saying with our actions, I trust that God will provide. I believe that my needs will be met. I believe that what I have is meant to bless others. And something miraculous happens when we do that. Our giving becomes a form of freedom. When we give our time and our finances, we resist the lie of scarcity. When we give, we remember that our worth isn't in our possessions, but in our participation in God's grace. When we give, we join that long line of saints from Moses and Miriam to Jesus and the early church, who learned that abundance is born from trust. The text tells us that some gathered much and some gathered little, but all had enough, which is a beautiful picture of the church at its best. Some of us have a lot to give, a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of resources. Some of us have little. But when we gather and offer what we have together, we become a community of enough. The miracle of manna wasn't just that bread appeared, but that a wandering people became a community through the act of gathering and sharing. Every Sunday when we come together, bringing our prayers and our gifts and our stories, we are reenacting that same miracle. We gather what we have, and somehow, by God's grace, there is enough for everyone. I sometimes wonder how those first Israelites felt on day one of manna. Did they step out of their tents with skepticism? Did they wonder if it would come again tomorrow? Probably so. Trust takes time. The wilderness is long. But day after day, as the manna fell, they began to learn. God's faithfulness was not a one-time event. It was a daily rhythm. And so maybe that's the invitation for us to look around and notice the manna moments in our own lives, the small provisions that sustain us, the unexpected kindnesses, the peace that comes just when we need it, the strength to get through one more day. These are the modern manna experiences that remind us that God is still providing. Our theme for the next few weeks is blessed to be a blessing, which is not just a catchy phrase, but a summary of the entire biblical story. From Abraham and Sarah to the Israelites in the wilderness to the church in Acts, the pattern is the same. God blesses people not for their own comfort, but so they can bless others. Blessings flow outward. Grace multiplies in motion. And when we live with open hands, we become part of God's ongoing miracle of provision in the world. The manna that sustained Israel became bread that sustained the world through Jesus, who said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry." And now that same Christ invites us to be bread for others, to be nourishing and generous and grace-filled. Stewardship is really a daily practice of noticing manna, a practice of noticing God's provision in our own lives, receiving it with gratitude, and sharing it freely. It is not about guilt or obligation, but about freedom. The freedom to live from abundance instead of fear. The freedom to trust that we will be given what we need one day at a time. And the freedom to participate in God's work of blessing the world. So here's the good news as we begin this season. We do not have to have it all figured out. We don't have to store up endless reserves of faith or money or certainty. We just need to trust enough for today. God will meet us where we are. Grace will find us in the morning. And when we gather what we've been given and share it, we'll discover again and again that there is enough, more than enough, for the journey ahead. And in response, our souls will awaken, and we will give thanks and sing. Thanks be to God. Amen.